Welcome back to another edition of the Edge podcast. Publisher Brenden Slaughter here for BeaversEdge.com, joined by Beavers Edge writers Ryan Harlan and TJ Mathewson. TJ Mathewson also doubles as KGO, working for them as well. It's great to be back on the podcast with you guys again. Coming to you guys following Oregon State's 21-zip win over the San Diego State Aztecs last week to move to 2-0. And feels pretty weird, fellas, but it's Civil War week on in the third week of September. Like, it is so weird to have this game here, but nevertheless, here we are. Excited to dive into it with Ryan and TJ, and then special edition later in the podcast. We're going to be joined by Justin Myers, my host from Rip City Mornings, devoted Duck fan, and get his take on the Ducks. And I think a few more nerves are creeping into Duck fans' minds about this game. So a lot to talk about as we kind of get into it, but let's go ahead and start with the meat and potatoes and get into San Diego State. Obviously a very, Ryan, you and I were texting back and forth during the game, very slow, weird game. And when you strip everything else away, as TJ mentioned just before we hopped on, one Jack Conne miss of hitting the ball, and it's 7-7 early in the third quarter. And that is a very different game script than what would have been, the 21-0 final that it ended up being. So we'll go ahead and start with you, Ryan, then move over to you, TJ, but just kind of your early takeaways from that game. And was it what you needed to see from the Beavers on the road, just compared to how we had heard, the road, and it had been so deeply connected to Jonathan Smith and some of his playing down on the road. We talked about it last podcast. Was it better in that regard, or you still need to see more?
There were aspects, I would say, that were good. Starting fast, getting that early touchdown. I think that was definitely something that you didn't quite see a lot of Smith's teams do in previous years. But I think kind of after that, that's where things kind of unraveled and became a little bit weird, where the inconsistencies and probably some fans were kind of looking, being like, "Oh, same old Beavers on the road there again." And I know I was sitting there, I'm like, "Oh gosh!" Like every drive, I was kind of thinking, like, "Okay, are they going to give this one away? Are they going to give this next drive away?" And kind of just where is the drawing everything consistently together, especially on offense. But what I did like was that they got Giovanni McCoy into a rhythm relatively early in the passing game, which was something I wanted to see early on. And the running game translated well over on the road as well. But I think there's still some things that need to be worked out on both the defensive side of the ball and offensive side of the ball. I mean, Jaden Robinson today was saying that he thought that the secondary left some plays out there and could, use some improvement in that regard. But really, for the most part, if I had to give it like a letter grade, I'd probably give it like a solid B minus.
Yeah.
Around there. Much improved, but I think they need to tighten some things up a little bit more.
Yeah, it definitely, like I said, the growth from week 1 to week 2 was definitely evident for me. I mean, if they would have played that way against Idaho State, I don't think you would have seen Idaho State be in the game for as long as it was. So obviously that's the growth you like to see. TJ, you were the one of us who did not pick the Beavers in this game and had to give you a little bit of a fun, hard time. Don't worry, we're not going to make you go stand in a Waffle House for 24 hours. But I will say on top of that, double whammy, my fantasy team edged yours this weekend, so I'm feeling pretty good about that too.
Yeah, I had a tough week across the board there.
But no, I'm just curious your kind of takeaways from the game. And obviously I know you still predicted a very close game. Did it surprise? I believe you were 34-28 maybe, or something along those lines. Did it surprise you that it turned out to be the game that it was, and just kind of I want to call it sleepy game until the Beavers decided they wanted to take over the game in the fourth quarter?
Surprise, no, based on what we watched. It was clear both offenses still had a lot of growth to sort of get oiled up and consistently scored some points, especially San Diego State. I think I just had higher expectations for them being able to, especially just run the ball. But man, what I took away was just the physical, like the physical imposement, I think that's the right word, of the Beavers on both sides of the football. Like, they went on the road and just out physicaled an opponent with their run game, and then the defense on all three levels really just pushed San Diego State around. Marquez Cooper, who in my prediction, I said, well, it's a pretty good back. He's got a lot of yards in his career. He's done it against some pretty good opponents. He might have a good game. Well, he did not. He could not break free. And they were mentioning, I think, whether it was Trent or someone else was mentioning, they keyed in on his spin move, which he likes to go to when he runs, and they knew whenever you spin it, all right, just go with it.
Yeah,
we got that. So they had that so dialed in, and there was never a moment in the game, even when San Diego State had the ball inside the 5-yard line before they fumbled the ball. Beavers got it back and then burned 8 minutes on a 98-yard touchdown drive. There was never a moment where you felt like the Beavers didn't have control of the game just because of how they played physically on both sides of the ball. That's what I thought lacked week one. We wanted to see, power 4 physicality. Or do you still have the bodies to clearly say we're a class above physically on the line of scrimmage? Didn't get that sense week one. But week two, yeah, I did. Seriously. And when you have the ability to do that, it doesn't matter as much what your quarterback does.
It's true.
Because your quarterback knows I can hand the ball off, or whenever I sit in the pocket, I will have the necessary time I need because we're pushing people around up there. And Jam Griffin, when he talked on Tuesday, was like, yep, I could see them there. They didn't want any more business with us because we were just pushing them around so much, over communicating, all this kind of stuff. And you know what that kind of leads you into? It kind of makes you feel a whole lot better about this upcoming Saturday. I thought, if we went back to before week one, it's Oregon with all these 5 stars everywhere on both lines, future NFL players everywhere. They're going to push the Beavers around. I'm sitting here thinking now, I'm like, no, I don't think so. I think this Beaver team's gonna match up pretty well physically, and that's what I think the most important thing the Beavers could have taken away from week two.
No, that's a terrific point, TJ. And, I think that you kind of go back to something that we kind of hoped we would see happen when we dove into the schedule preseason. We sat here and looked and said, I'm just going to go with the lower, but San Diego State, let's just rule out Idaho State being the first, but San Diego State, we've seen what Air Force is this year. We've seen San Jose State. We've seen Nevada. We've seen Colorado State. Some of these teams we mentioned, will it be obvious that Oregon State just has power 4 dudes still left over in the trenches to where they can physically impose themselves? And to your point, TJ, San Diego State, probably one of the lesser teams. Again, full-scale rebuild, probably as far as just the offensive talent minus Cooper. They'll get there in a couple of years as, O'Neal's a good quarterback and you can see the flashes, but they're just not there yet. There will be at least a few more teams on the schedule where that is the case, where they can physically overmatch. So I think that should give Beaver fans some good optimism to guard against, the worst case scenario this season, which I think we've seen good things in weeks 1 and 2. But to that point, going into, this next, or rather go back to the defense on that side. First shutout, fellas, since 1976 in a win. I'm going to go out on a limb and say most of our parents were pretty little when that happened. So very long time ago. Justin and I had to look. It was the Ford administration, if you can believe that. And, just even though it's San Diego State, you still have to respect a 0 on the, that's still, and I believe it was 100 and I don't have the exact number. It was 100 and some, 137 total yards of offense, I think. Maybe I'm butchering it slightly for San Diego State.
179.
79, thank you. And they just manhandled it. Other than that drive where they set up that Oregon State obviously forced the fumble on 3rd and goal, where the errant punt had given San Diego State the ball around midfield. Guys, San Diego State had 2 drives that were more than 50 yards. That was it. They couldn't even move the ball across midfield. And again, your challenge, we saw it this last weekend, a real shootout in Eugene between Oregon and Boise State. This next team can score points, right? So I'm curious to see how that ultimately flushes itself out. But overall, you guys would you guys say that you're more pleased with where the offense is or where the defense is heading into the Oregon week?
Defense without question.
I'd say defense. I think offense, they still need to see, I think, a little more in the passing game from Giovanni McCoy. And it's more of just kind of how these first 2 weeks have played out, where they've leaned on the run so heavily. But Yeah, it's just seeing how he runs the passing game this week, and that's really what I'm looking for, and seeing if Gunderson can, get more of those explosive plays called in the game.
Right.
Like
And obviously,
we know the identity of the offense, but can they stack touchdowns if they need to?
Yeah.
We haven't seen that yet. And San Diego State, not a world beater of a defense, and neither is Idaho State. And the Beavers showed, yeah, we can hold the ball, we can get first downs, but can you stack touchdowns? Because the team on the other side that you're going to play on Saturday, while their offense has been very inconsistent. Well, we'll get into that when we talk to Justin here later in the podcast. They are explosive. They
right.
have some absolute dudes on the outside, and they can score like that. Can you
Right.
match that? Like one play touchdowns versus the Beavers are going to need 12 plays to score a touchdown.
Right.
It's not great math.
Right. And you look at it like Oregon would have lost to Boise State, but what do? They get a kick return touchdown, right? And that's because flat out, like, again, this is nothing new, but Oregon is going to have speed that you simply do not have. So going back to like what Keith Hayward was saying about gap integrity and things along those lines, this week is going to be very important because, again, to that matchup, like Oregon, while they've been down, like TJ said, when I did this preview 2.5 weeks ago, this spread was almost 30 points. It's now 16 today. And from what I've heard, Oregon is minus 53 against or 58, excuse me, against the spread in the first 2 weeks. So Oregon has, quote, played, you can say played down to their competition. I think Boise is a pretty solid group this year, so I don't want to say that negatively to Boise, but Boise ain't ranked in the top 25. They aren't ranked in the top 15. They aren't even ranked in the top 10, right? This is preseason number 2 or number 3 Oregon team. And, obviously they could get there by the time the season goes because they haven't lost a game. But, I've been a part of this rivalry for many, many years now. And this was on paper the best Oregon team I'd ever seen assembled, and was like TJ was saying earlier, like, this one, going to be a tough game for Oregon State, but it just is what it is. And now you look at it and, I'm just curious for you fellas, it seems like a weird benefit to Oregon State that you're playing Oregon early. Like, that obviously never happens, but this year at this time, at this moment, it's Oregon's first road game. I know it's still 40 miles up the road, but still.
Hey, you're going into a hostile environment in a rivalry matchup where I think this is going to be the first time since COVID, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you're going to have fans on the west side.
Oh yeah, COVID
in there.
COVID.
And so that's going to be a big factor as well too. I mean, I know in 2022 I was there in the stands, and with half a stadium it was loud, and now I can't imagine what it's going to be like full stadium with the new west side in that regard. And yeah, even looking like to last week, I saw from Oregon's performance against Idaho, I was thinking, I like Boise State's chances to make this a very close game. And sure enough, going into this week, I feel very similarly. Not necessarily saying that Beavers, are going to win outright. No, like you never know what can happen. But like, I think they make this more competitive than what the spread is being given right now.
Yeah, it strikes me as a game that is going to be weird because, again, I think that you have the factor on Oregon State sideline of like, whether or not they want to admit it or not, there's at least a handful of guys in this locker room who look at Oregon as the reason they were left, one of the reasons they were left out of the Pac-12, a real, you're better than us concept. And I think in that respect, like for Oregon State, it's like, let's go out and try to punch these guys in the mouth, figuratively, of course. And for Oregon, there's a ton of pressure on Oregon in this game compared to Oregon State, where it's kind of like, again, not to be pessimistic, but I think there were a whole lot of Beaver fans who before the season were like, yeah, you can go 11-1, right? Yeah. I mean, the most optimistic Beaver fans, like, yeah, 11-1, dude, easy peasy. So I think from that perspective, it hasn't really changed a lot for Oregon State, where they're like, hey, okay, things have tightened up a little bit here. We're still gonna, like Ryan said, just kind of another game for us. We're just gonna go do our thing. Whereas to Oregon, you had 2 home games. You have not looked good in either. And now you go on the road to a place that I'm sure still gives Dan Lanning a few, bad memories from 2 years ago. That was
And he
obviously
said so. Yeah, he
right.
said so.
Yep,
He
he
thinks
did.
about it quite often.
Yep. So again, a very, like, and you can kind of see it, right? Oregon paid back the favor last year. Was Oregon State distracted, told information before the game that maybe would have affected how they would play in that game? 100%. But again, Oregon paid back the favor in Autzen Stadium last year. So I just wonder how many guys like Jaden Robinson that were there kind of remember how Josh Gray, how painful that game was under the circumstances. Like, a week prior, you were in it with Washington to still be in the Pac-12 championship, and then you kind of lay an egg in Eugene because we all know what was coming down the pipe. And, I think that part of it just adds so much intrigue to this game. The fans, like you mentioned, Ryan, first full research since 2018 in that regard. And, I think the fans will do well as far as like, I think it'll be a mostly Beaver crowd. I don't think there'll be a solid contingent of Duck fans, but I don't think it'll be, half and half by any means. And again, a very winnable game compared to what we saw. And obviously, here in a few minutes when we let Ryan go, we'll kind of get a little bit more on why Oregon is, struggling this year compared to years past. But just kind of final thoughts from each of you guys. What would be your keys to victory? I'll start with Ryan. We'll go to TJ, and then I'll finish it off. And just like one or two keys that you see for Oregon State, because again, I'm just reading the room here, guys. I think 2-3 weeks ago, we all would have very confidently projected an Oregon win. I think today we're all kind of like, it's a little bit more up in the air than it was. So I think, with that being said, I think it is possible for Oregon State to win this game. Not that it wasn't before the season started, but I think it's very realistic as far as like you could see a game plan where they keep it close kind of a thing. And then, like Ryan said, the ball bounces your way. Maybe you get lucky, maybe you don't, but I think they'll play competitively. So start with you, Ryan. What do you see as the keys in this matchup?
I think my biggest key for the offense is controlling time of possession, being smart with the football, because you have an explosive offense on the other side. And the biggest key to slow down an explosive offense with guys that have a ton of speed is to hold on to the ball as long as possible. And we've seen that they can do it. Now, that also kind of comes to bite you a little bit as well, too, because if you fumble or if you make a mistake or you throw a pick, you're not going to have as much time to get your back your way into the game if it's suddenly a 2-possession lead or more. So there is that. But I think if they control the ball, they keep Oregon very limited on offense. I think they have a shot of staying in this game. And then on defense, it's just playing smart, playing with integrity through those gaps, and just making sure that none of those guys beat you over the top. Because that's going to be the biggest thing, I think, for them on defense, is just being able to slow down that trio of receivers that they have, along with Dylan Gabriel as well.
Teach?
I would just take a look right at Oregon State's defensive line against Oregon's offensive line. The Ducks led the country in sacks allowed, meaning fewest sacks allowed, the last 2 seasons with Bo Nix. They've already allowed 7 this year. They've allowed more in 2 games than they allowed in each of the last 2 full seasons. So if I'm going to circle one guy, Thomas Collins has been an absolute wrecking ball in the middle of the defense. And that Oregon middle of their offensive line has been a disaster so far. So Thomas Collins could just totally ruin this game and throw the Oregon offense off script. Like this is an offense that is going to need to be explosive to score. Last week, they only had 2 drives of longer than 5 plays. Think about that with all those players. 2 drives of longer than 5 plays. It's a good way to keep the offense to less than 5 plays a drive is to sack the quarterback. Dylan Gabriel has not been getting the ball out as on time as Bo Nix does. And I think if the Oregon State defensive line plays their best game of the season against the Ducks, the offense, they're going to have struggle to score points. Like they're really going to struggle to score points unless there's a blown coverage or there is a just perfectly timed pass. Because in terms of stringing together consistent plays, not only have they not been able to do that, but then they've also managed to bite themselves with penalties as well. So that defensive line can really just change it. Like we know what the Oregon State offense is going to do. They're going to run the ball 60 to 70% of the time, and they're going to hold on to it for as long as possible. But when the competition rises, is the Oregon State defensive line going to go out there and dictate what Oregon's offense can do on the other side?
No, that's yeah, couldn't agree more, TJ. I'll kind of add on that and go personnel on defense, key. Do we get Noble Thomas back? Right. Obviously, Sai Vidrale played a great game at Nickelback in place of him this last week, but you'd love to have Noble Thomas back. And then to that point on the offensive line, TJ, this is a game where you'd like to have Olu Omotosho back, where it's like, obviously Olu played really well in like the 7 snaps I think he played in week 1 before kind of went down with that minor ding. From what I had heard, it was kind of more like, hey, he probably could have gone against San Diego State, and they were kind of holding them back for this Oregon week. So his availability for pass rush, because you're right, TJ, and we'll get into it with Justin a little bit. That offensive line has not been good, and for Oregon to be a preseason number 2 team, I know they had a couple just a couple injuries. To have that little depth and be a top 10 preseason team is interesting to me.
And not in that conference.
Right. Like that's kind of interesting to me because we just talked about it with, Tyler Volton obviously going down on Oregon State side for the year. Is like they have a redshirt senior ready to step into that stead, and a redshirt senior in Flavio Gonzalez who played really consistently all camp. Was he quite at the same high level that Volton was? But just Oregon State's got the benefit of having some solid depth pieces on that line. And then offensively, my last key on this side. So obviously everything TJ said, I want to see some personnel back because I think that'd be huge. And then offensively, they've been setting it up. I want to see Giovanni McCoy pull the ball in the zone read. Oregon has not seen a quarterback these first 2 weeks who has literally been able to take off and run. And I think the fact that you haven't seen the Beavers, I mean, every time they have set it up probably over 100 plays now on film where it is, zone read, McCoy just toodles off to the side kind of a thing. We've seen Jabari Johnson take a big run, but I think Giovanni McCoy in that run game could be the backbreaker because I still think that Oregon's defense is solid despite, what they did last week. I mean, I think Boise's quite good. I think GT is the best running back in the country. But I'm curious to see how that all flushes itself out. And I think McCoy could be an X factor there. And then on that part with injuries, do we see Darius Clemens, right? He would be a huge swoon to that receiver room and just another weapon for Giovanni McCoy to throw to. So we'll go ahead and take a quick break here on the Edge podcast. We'll say goodbye to Ryan Harlan until Saturday when we see him at at Reeser Stadium.
I was going to say, what stadium are we at?
I know, force a habit from last season, I suppose. But yes, then we will we'll take a quick break. We'll come back here in just a few minutes and come back with Justin Myers. We'll talk a little Oregon Ducks, TJ and I and him. So keep it locked right here to the Edge podcast. Big shout out to Ryan Harlan for joining us, and make sure to stay locked into Edge all week and weekend long for all the CW coverage. Welcoming you back to the Edge podcast. Publisher Brenden Slaughter here, joined by BeaversEdge writer TJ Mathewson, and joined by RipCityMornings host Justin Myers, back on the podcast for the second time. Not even in a total year, Justin. We had you on last November. Here we are having you in September. Good to see you, man. It's a little weird catching up in the afternoon. But just like same thing we've talked about all week. How weird is it to have this game as early as it is? Like, it's still freaking me out.
It's really weird. By the way, glad to be back here. I thought after my last appearance that I would be banned for life. As you guys put the departure of Jonathan Smith on me as if it was my fault. But I am happy to be back. Also happy to be talking to you and to TJ and all of the Beaver believers out there who secretly love me. You all say you hate me, but you all secretly love me. But more importantly, yes, let's just address the weird elephant in the room. It's weird in September to be talking about this game. It's weird to even be thinking about calling this the Civil War. If some people still want to call it Civil War, I'm old school. I still call it that. And to think about having a game that has implications. Like there's no denying that there's actually implications in this game, but they're nothing like what they once were. And are there going to be now new traditions? Are there going to be kind of a new way we kind of view this rivalry? Will the rivalry stay as heated as it's always been? We don't know. And we're going to find out in the future. But yeah, it is weird to not have the stakes of the season online or on the line for the game, which usually is you can either spoil it for your rival, you can try to get to a better bowl. Sometimes the conference or we've talked about the Civil War for the Roses. None of that's at stake right now. Right now, at stake is, can Oregon figure out their season from the expectations they had, and the Beavers kind of their next test into figuring out just what kind of season they're going to have. It's very odd, and we're all in T-shirts, and we're going to be wearing sunscreen at the game, and it's going to be weird.
Teach.
Why does Oregon look so slow to start the season? It doesn't make any sense to me how a team with that many talented players could play two close games like that to start.
All right, I've got two answers for you. First answer is, TJ, if I knew the answer to that, I would not be talking to you. I would be talking to Dan Lanning, and I would be getting paid $100,000 if I knew the actual answer to that.
Fair.
Two, what I think is the real reason, and I know it's kind of a dirty word. Dare I say it? They're a little overrated. I mean, there's a ton of. I know.
Are you allowed to say that?
Dare I? I know. Hard to believe that a team that is replacing a Heisman Trophy candidate quarterback, an All-American running back who had maybe the second best day of a rookie that rookie had in the NFL in week one, in Bucky Irving, an All-American wide receiver who may be the best wide receiver in Oregon football history. Oh, and the Remington Trophy winner of the best center in all of college football. Yeah, you're replacing all of that, and it's just supposed to go smoothly in Eugene. It's just not the way it's ever been. Now, they replaced all those guys with talented players, but they haven't played together. There's no chemistry. There's no connectivity. And I know that kind of stuff gets kind of overlooked, but it's important. It's important in football to kind of know the guy you're playing next to, and it just kind of takes time. But yeah, I just think that Dylan Gabriel's not as good as Bo Nix. Hard to say, but he's not right now. The offensive line is nowhere close to as good as the offensive line was last year. And I know the wide receivers have maybe a claim that they're maybe the best wide receiver core in the country, but when you can't protect your quarterback and you can't sustain drives, you can't get the running game going, doesn't matter how good your wide receivers are. So yeah, maybe potentially, possibly they're a little overrated.
Yeah, like TJ was saying, Justin, that might be a dirty word amongst the Oregon fan base, but I'm just kind of curious, not so much in the sense of Oregon, but just as a bigger picture, like, is what we're seeing with Oregon potentially just early on, because they could, turn it around and still run the table and be undefeated. Like, that's possible. They haven't lost a game, so you never know how football shakes out. But do you think, like, this inconsistency and maybe having a team not meet expectations is kind of the other side of the transfer portal and bringing in so many guys who you're asking them to learn not only your culture, your system, your this, and maybe, like you said, that there will, for every, Ohio State that's out there that's able to, snap it and get all the transfers and instantly be really, really good, or, have some teams that hit the portal and it just doesn't quite work in the way they expected.
I mean, it's a possibility, right? Because I watch Oregon football in a vacuum, and I compare Oregon football to Oregon football in the past because I'm a homer, and that's the way I watch Oregon football. But then when I put my media hat on and I look across the country, right? Look, Ole Miss brought in a bunch of transfers too. They seem to be beating the doors off of everybody. Georgia brought in a handful of transfers. Now, they also brought in some really good high school players, and nobody looks better than Georgia right now. Even Ohio State, who looks like, if not the second, at least the third best team in college football, their quarterback's a transfer. They brought in a handful of transfers as well, and they seem to be figuring it out very, very early. So that might be part of it. It might be part of it that just this is going to be kind of a slow churn for Oregon, and that as long as they escape kind of that the tragic loss, which was really on the table last week against Boise, as long as they escape that maybe by mid-October they're starting to play better football. That's a possibility. But you look across the country, the Oregon model, with the way they're building their roster, isn't unique, right? They've been recruiting well in high school, and then they're plug and playing with skill position guys. Georgia's done it. Ohio State's done it. Ole Miss has done it. Even Texas, to a degree, has done it. And those guys all look real good.
What is it that Bo Nix did so well that Dylan Gabriel hasn't been doing the first couple of weeks?
get the ball out fast. I think that's the biggest thing, and I think that goes back to connection with the receivers. I think familiarity with his personnel is he got the ball out so fast. Think about this: Bo Nix got sacked 6 times last year.
Yeah.
And Dylan Gabriel has been sacked 6 times this season in 2 games. Now, a lot of that's on the offensive line, but it's Idaho and Boise State. It's not like it's the defensive ends of Ohio State, Michigan, and Wisconsin that they're going to have to play later on this season. And I think a good chunk of the reason that Bo never got touched was A, the offensive line was really good, and B, he got the ball out so fast, always making real fast decisions. Now, he took some criticism for it, right? They called him check down Charlie, and that he doesn't throw the ball deep, but you know what? That kept him from getting sacked. It kept drives alive, and it kept things moving. So to me, I think that's the biggest difference with the two was Bo Nix just got the ball out so fast.
Justin, there's something I want to get your take on, and actually something that will be, I think, a fantastic topic for us tomorrow morning. So something to keep in mind. But TJ and I were talking about last segment. We found the situation has flipped from 10 years ago where Oregon this week has called this game, some players called it their Super Bowl, compared to Oregon State, which has been just another game. And that is an inverse of that's like Chip Kelly versus kind of Mike Riley. Where do you land on what to how to approach this game? And do you find that interesting that it seemingly the narrative in that respect is flipped, because it didn't used to be that way at all?
It's incredibly interesting. I think that's also for Oregon State the benefit of really not having to win this game to still have an incredibly successful season, right? And that's been the benchmark for 100 and some years. You want a successful season, you better win Civil War, right? You could, and we've seen it in years. There's been plenty of Oregon teams that I've watched that were good, went on to big-time bowl games, but if they lost to Oregon State, that's not a successful season. Well, now you're sitting there where Oregon State doesn't have to have a win against Oregon in week 3 to really define their season. So I think that's kind of part of the new normal that we're all in. And I think also, look, Dan Lanning was on the sidelines 2 years ago when you all ran the ball 17 straight times right down his throat and couldn't stop it. And Lanning, I don't know him personally, but feels like a guy that remembers things like that. And I think that's why Oregon maybe has put a lot of emphasis on this game. And Trent Bray is maybe going the other way of nope, it's just another game. We have other things to figure out. And here's the other part of it. Oregon can get away with, hey, overlooked Idaho. Happens in week 1, right? It was you were favored by almost 50 points. You got a little snake bit. And the second week, Boise might be pretty good. Boise might end up winning the Mountain West. And, they may have a legitimate Heisman Trophy candidate in the backfield. Maybe Boise's that good. But if you play a close game or even take a loss against Oregon State, well, it's no longer about them. It's about you. And I think that's the difference for Oregon is this is an identity game. If they play another close game, because they're favored by about 16 right now, they're minus 54 against the spread. I've been talking about that number for the last 2 weeks. They're minus 54 against the spread. If they go another double digits against the spread and don't win this game comfortably, well, then their entire season might take a complete left turn, because then it's not about the opponents, it's about you.
What does that identity need to be?
It's got to be attacking at the line of scrimmage and controlling the game. This is what's crazy is against Boise, right? We may look back on that game and be like, man, what a good game against 2 teams that maybe go into the playoffs. I don't know if I'm ready to say Oregon's a playoff team quite yet because of the way that they performed, but the bigger worry is against a team like Idaho, who's a good FCS team. You should be able to tell them the play. If you are a FBS Power 4 top 10 team, you should be able to tell them the play and still block them with your offensive line and run the ball at will. They couldn't run the ball against Idaho, and they kind of got the running game going a little bit, but couldn't really run the ball against Boise, having unbalanced offense. So to me, like you said, that identity is being able to control the line of scrimmage, run the ball at will, because you just have better dudes than Idaho, than Boise, and you're supposed to against Oregon State. But if you don't, well, then maybe you don't have the dudes, and then you have to really change your expectations.
Yeah, along that same lines, Justin, I'm curious. Obviously, it's just 40 miles up the road, but you mentioned two kind of up and down games, but you had the benefit of being at home. We were talking about it today. It'll be the first Reser Stadium that's full since 2018, which is actually kind of crazy when you think about it that way. And, to your point, we were talking about a little bit that, Dan Lanning during his press conference earlier this week said he thinks about 2022 a lot. And it's something that's all like, is that something where obviously on one hand you could be really prepared, but on the other hand, maybe you're kind of overthinking it a little bit to 2 years ago from just the way that game came out? Like, where do you take obviously Oregon going on the road early in the season, despite just being 40 miles. And we know that they're going to take I-5, Justin, not.
Yeah,
99.
I know. By the way, 1,000 likes on that
Oh,
tweet.
damn, man. Let's go. Let's
set
go.
Twitter on fire with giving an alternate route to the Research Stadium for Oregon. But listen, here's the thing. First off, you go the route of 99, right? There's an Abby's in Junction City. There's a Papa's Pizza in South Corvo. There's the Long Branch right there. I-5, like you got an A&W at the exit. Like that's about it. Anyways, getting back to your question. For me personally, I would rather my coach take a rivalry game more serious than not. So I don't know if it's going to be a good strategy or bad strategy to continually bring up what happened a couple years ago and what happened at Research Stadium. But the fact is, Oregon hasn't won there in 6 years. Like you said, they lost the game 2 years ago in the construction site. They lost the game with no fans. Boy, a lot of fans showed up outside of the stadium after that win, though. Well, those Beaver believers in their F-150 sure made it to the parking lot real fast, spinning donuts out there celebrating that win. So yeah, in an empty stadium in COVID year and in the construction site last year, Oregon's come out. They're 0-2 at Reser in their last 2 attempts. So if we're going to take this rivalry seriously, which I hope we do, and I know me and the Oregon State fans may see differently as to whether or not this rivalry should have continued. I love that it continued, and I hope it's taken seriously, and that comes from the head coach. And I think that's a good sign from Dan Lanning, is that, you know what, he's at least going to take this rivalry game seriously. I know that Chip was undefeated, and he kept saying it's just another game. I hated it. I hated it the whole time. This is important to your fan base. It is important to the state of Oregon. It is important to the local economies, and I'm glad that at least this game is being treated seriously. It's never going to be as what it was. We have to live with that.
Yeah.
But what it is could still be a serious, hard-fought, emotional rivalry game, even if it's in September. I think that's a good thing.
And at least they're playing it on campus too, and not at a half-empty NFL stadium. So that's a plus. Last thing for me, Justin, give me a key why Oregon will win, and give me a key why Oregon could lose this game.
Oh yeah.
Oregon wins if they run the ball effectively, and if they run the ball effectively, I think offensively that's the key to starting everything that they want to do in terms of keeping Oregon's defense on their heels. Getting Dylan Gabriel free and not getting sacked and not getting touched. So to me, running the football at the point of attack, first downs, getting big chunks of yards in the running game, that's the key. On the defensive side, I think it's again controlling the line of scrimmage. You look at what Oregon was able to do against Idaho. Idaho had one trick play. Other than that, they gave up a touchdown. What they didn't do well was try to contain Genty at Boise State. And I know it sounds boring, but look, there's a reason why coaches say you got to stop the run and you got to be able to run the ball. And I think for Oregon State, they want to ugly this game up. And I think that's probably the best strategy, right? Is if you ugly this game up and you get into a slobber knocker and all of a sudden, Oregon's offense is over on the sideline the entire time. You guys. Well, I don't know about you, TJ. I know Brenden plays video games. When you're just like going into game control mode in the first quarter, and you drive your brother crazy in Madden or in college football. Like that's what Trent Bray, I think, is going to try to do in that first half. Is let's see if we can just keep the ball as long as possible and drive them crazy.
Absolutely. No, and last thing for me, Justin, as we let you go again, Justin Myers joining us here on the Edge podcast. Justin, like, just compared to like what this game was when the season started, more nerves for Oregon fans now than like a couple weeks ago. And do you think that there is added more pressure on Oregon side than Oregon State side in this contest?
Massively more pressure on Oregon side, because even though they didn't play well in the first 2 weeks, like I said, you can still kind of squint and tilt your head and go like, well, maybe it was something else. Maybe it was this. Maybe it was that. Again, you go into week 3 against Oregon State and you don't. Sorry to say, if you don't dominate, well, then you got other problems. Whereas Oregon State does get to play with their hair on fire, right? They can take chances, they can throw trick plays, because truly, if you lose this game, even if you lose this game bad, you get right back into your season. You can still win 8, 9, 10 games when you look at the schedule ahead, and you're going to be fine. But I think there's way more stakes now on Oregon. If the Idaho game never happened, I think it's a different animal, right? If Oregon went out and beat Idaho by 40 and then still needed a field goal at the end of regulation to beat Boise, I think we're looking at this game probably the same as it was. And I think the point spread's probably somewhere in the 20s. The fact that the Idaho game happened and then you had what was supposed to be a bounce back game against Boise, and now you have a third, hey, you want to prove to everybody how good you are. You want to be a top 10 team as you're sitting at 9 right now. Well, this is your last chance to prove it before you play Big Ten schools.
Absolutely. And again, we'll find out at Saturday, 12:30 Fox kickoff for Oregon State and Oregon this weekend. Big shout out to Justin Myers for joining us on the part 2 of today's Edge podcast. Justin, appreciate you. I will see you the rest of this week, and enjoy the game on Saturday, my friend.
Brenden, TJ, good to talk to you boys. Always happy to connect with Beaver Nation. I love you guys, even though you say you don't love me.
Oh, well, for Justin Myers and TJ Mathewson, this is Brenden Slaughter signing off again. Big shout out to Ryan Harlan, Justin Myers, TJ Mathewson for joining me on this edition of the Edge podcast today. Stay locked into Beaver's Edge all week long for all of our content leading up to the Civil War.